The barn sat low against the earth like a crouching animal, its roofline barely clearing 12 feet at the peak. And when Thomas Morrison rode past on his way to the Mercantile in Salina, he reined his horse to study the peculiar structure with the expression of a man watching someone dig their own grave. Heinrich Wolf, 42 years old and 3 months removed from burying his wife to pneumonia, was driving the last of the iron stakes that anchored the building's corners to bedrock 18 inches below the prairie soil, and the methodical rhythm of his hammer suggested he'd stopped caring what anyone thought sometime around the 4th funeral he'd attended that winter. Heinrich had arrived in Saline County, Kansas on September 3, 1883, with $127, 2 draft horses, a wagon containing carpentry tools his grandfather had used in Bavaria, and the kind of grief that made men either drink themselves to death or work until exhaustion replaced thinking. He'd purchased 160 acres 8 miles southwest of Salina for $1, $25 per acre through the Homestead Act, and the land agent, a nervous man named Pruitt, who'd watched too many settlers fail, had tried to talk him out of it, explaining that this particular section sat in what the locals called the corridor, a stretch of prairie where tornadoes touched down with the regularity of harvest seasons. Heinrich had signed the papers anyway because the land was cheap, flat, and far enough from town that his neighbors wouldn't hear him if he needed to scream. The barn he was building looked wrong to everyone who saw it. Traditional barns in Kansas stood tall and proud, with high gambrel roofs that maximized hay storage and vertical walls that announced prosperity. Heinrich's structure crouched against the earth like it was trying to hide, with a gently curved roof that peaked at just 12 feet and walls that sloped inward at a 15-degree angle from foundation to roofline. The door openings were positioned on the east and west walls rather than the traditional south-facing entrance, and he'd refused to include the cupola and weather vane that every proper barn required. Most baffling of all, he'd spent 3 weeks digging foundation trenches 2 feet deep and filling them with limestone rocks mortared together, then driving iron stakes through the sills into bedrock. Work that seemed insane for a building that would house nothing but animals and hay. Thomas Morrison, who at 61 had survived 34 Kansas springs and the tornado seasons they brought, was the first to say out loud what others were thinking. He was a broad-shouldered man who'd lost his left eye to flying debris in the twister of '68, and he'd built his own barn 3 times, each reconstruction taller and sturdier than the last. "Heinrich," he called out, swinging down from his saddle, "you're building a root cellar with windows. Animals need air circulation, and hay needs height for proper curing. That roof won't shed rain worth a damn." Heinrich drove another stake, tested its resistance with his full weight, and only then looked up. "My grandfather built wine cellars in the Rhine Valley," he said in the thick German accent that made some locals assume he was stupid. "Underground storage, curved ceilings. The monks who commissioned them had kept records for 400 years. They knew which structures survived and which collapsed." He wiped sweat from his forehead, though the October temperature held steady at 54 degrees Celsius. "I'm not building for rain." Reverend Samuel Hutchins, 48, who served the Methodist congregation in Salina and considered himself an educated man, he'd attended 2 years of seminary in Ohio, stopped by on October 12th with theological concerns disguised as neighborly advice. He was a thin man who gestured constantly when he spoke, and he'd performed funeral services for 23 settlers in the past 5 years, many of them killed when their barns collapsed during storms and trapped them inside. "Brother Wolf," he began, standing at a careful distance from the construction as if failure might be contagious, "Proverbs tells us that wisdom is proved right by her deeds. The farmers here have 30 years of experience with what works. This design—" He paused, searching for diplomatic language. It contradicts every principle of animal husbandry I've observed. Heinrich was fitting the roof beams, curved cottonwood pieces he'd steamed and bent over forms, a technique that had taken him 6 weeks to perfect. Each beam was 14 feet long and arched in a gentle parabola that would create a rounded ceiling inside. "Reverend," he said, not looking down from his work, "have you noticed that prairie dog tunnels survive tornadoes, that grass-covered hills don't blow apart?" He secured the beam with mortise and tenon joints, reinforced by iron brackets. Wind doesn't destroy curves, it destroys corners. Martha Chen, 39, whose husband operated the lumber mill in Salina, and who therefore considered herself an expert on construction economics, arrived on October 18th with the account ledger and grave news about Heinrich's financial future. She was a sharp-featured woman who'd managed the mill's books for 12 years and had watched enough settlers go bankrupt to know the warning signs. "Mr. Wolf, my husband tells me you've purchased 340 board feet of oak, 180 feet of iron rod, 60 pounds of nails, and 8 barrels of mortar. For a barn that size, you should need half those materials." She opened her ledger where she'd tracked his purchases. "You've spent $89 on materials. That's nearly 70% of your total capital for a building that, forgive my bluntness, looks like it belongs in a storybook, not a working farm." He was applying a mixture of prairie grass and clay between the wall boards, creating a thick layer that would provide insulation and structural reinforcement. His hands were cracked and bleeding from the work, but he pressed the mixture into every gap with the precision of a man who understood that details mattered. "Mrs. Chen, how much does it cost to rebuild a barn?" He didn't wait for her answer. "Thomas Morrison has built 3. Each time he loses animals, equipment, stored grain. Each time he starts with less than before." He continued packing the insulation. "I'm spending everything once, or I'm spending something forever." Jacob Reinhardt, 52, a German immigrant who'd arrived in Kansas 15 years earlier and now operated a successful wheat farm 6 miles north, stopped by on October 24th with the authority of someone from Heinrich's own culture. He was a heavy man with hands like leather and the kind of prosperity that came from doing things the American way. "Heinrich, I understand you're new here, but you're making yourself look foolish," he said in German, assuming privacy, though 2 other farmers were within earshot. "These people already think Germans are backwards. You build a barn that looks like a peasant's hovel, and you prove them right. Build tall, build proud, build American." Heinrich responded in English, loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I'm building to physics, not to pride." He was installing the door frames, which were reinforced with iron straps and designed to swing inward rather than outward. Air pressure differentials during tornadoes can create 70 pounds per square foot of outward force on walls. Every American barn I've seen has outward swinging doors and vertical walls. Both act like sails catching wind. He demonstrated how the inward sloping walls would deflect upward wind force. "I'm building to survive, Jacob. You can build for appearances if you want." By November 1st, the barn stood complete, and Heinrich knew every measurement by heart because he'd calculated each one a dozen times. The structure was 32 feet long, 24 feet wide, and 12 feet at the roof peak. The walls sloped inward at 15 degrees, creating a footprint that was wider at the base than at the roofline. The curved roof had no corners, no edges, no surfaces perpendicular to the ground where wind could catch and lift. The foundation trenches were 2 feet deep, filled with mortared limestone, and the sills were locked to bedrock with iron stakes every 4 feet. The walls themselves were double-layered, oak boards on the outside, cottonwood boards on the inside, with 6 inches of clay and grass insulation between them that added mass and structural integrity. If you like what you're hearing, please subscribe to Pioneer Survival Tales so you don't miss these stories of forgotten innovation. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. Now, back to Heinrich's barn and the neighbors who were about to learn a hard lesson. He'd grown up in the Rhine Valley, where his grandfather Otto Wolff had been a master builder specializing in wine cellars for monasteries and wealthy estates. Those cellars had to maintain constant temperature year-round, resist the pressure of earth above them, and survive for centuries. Otto had taught Heinrich that nature doesn't fight curves. Water flows around smooth stones, wind passes over hills, and pressure distributes evenly across arched surfaces. The principle was simple: eliminate corners, and you eliminate concentration points where force can multiply. Heinrich had calculated everything. A traditional barn roof, peaked at 35 to 40 degrees, created a surface area of roughly 900 square feet, perpendicular to upward wind flow. During a tornado, with wind speeds reaching 200 miles per hour, that surface would experience approximately 63,000 pounds of upward force, 31.5 tons trying to rip the roof off. His curved roof, sloped at a maximum of 30 degrees and rounded to deflect rather than resist, would experience less than half that force. And what force it did experience would be distributed evenly across the entire structure rather than concentrated at the corners and edges. The walls were engineered with the same principle. Vertical walls created a surface for wind to push against. His walls, sloping inward at 15 degrees, would deflect wind upward and over the structure. He'd done the mathematics. For every 10 miles per hour of wind speed, his angled walls would reduce lateral force by approximately 23% compared to vertical walls. At tornado wind speeds of 200 mph, that meant the difference between 15,000 pounds of force trying to push the walls over and 11,550 pounds, a reduction of 3,450 pounds, roughly the weight of 2 draft horses. The foundation was the critical element. He'd studied tornado damage reports from the past 20 years, accounts published in the Salina Journal and the Kansas City Star, and noticed a pattern. Barns didn't blow apart. They lifted off their foundations and then disintegrated. The initial failure was always at the base, where buildings sat on simple sills or stone piers that couldn't resist upward force. Heinrich had designed his foundation to prevent that first failure. The limestone trenches provided mass, approximately 8 tons of stone mortared into place. The iron stakes, driven 18 inches into bedrock and bolted through the sills, created physical anchors that would require the tornado to break iron or crack bedrock before it could lift the building. He'd built the barn in sections, working alone except when he needed to lift roof beams, at which times he hired day laborers from town for 50 cents per day. The foundation work had taken 3 weeks. The wall framing had taken 2 weeks, with each joint double-pegged and every corner reinforced with iron brackets. The roof beaming had taken another 2 weeks because each curve had to be perfect. The siding, insulation and finishing work had consumed 4 more weeks. By November 1st, he'd worked 84 days straight, losing 22 pounds from a frame that couldn't afford to lose weight, and his hands were so damaged that he couldn't make a fist. But the barn stood solid. The curved roof shed rain like water off a duck's back. The sloped walls created no dead air pockets, and the east-west door placement allowed cross-ventilation that kept the interior dry despite the fall humidity. He'd built stalls for 6 animals, storage for 12 tons of hay, and a tack room that doubled as emergency shelter. The entire structure felt immovable, as if it had grown from the earth rather than been built on it. His neighbors continued to visit, and their skepticism evolved into something like pity. Thomas Morrison brought venison in early November, claiming he'd shot too much for his own use. though Heinrich suspected the truth had more to do with how his ribs had started showing through his shirt. "You built a fine bunker," Thomas said, studying the interior with his one good eye. "But you're going to suffocate your animals come summer, and that hay won't cure properly with all this insulation holding moisture." Heinrich didn't argue. He'd learned that people needed to see results before they'd consider changing their minds, and he'd see results, or he'd die. There wasn't much middle ground. Winter came early that year. By mid-November, temperatures dropped to 18 degrees at night, and Heinrich brought his 2 draft horses, 3 dairy cows, and 8 chickens into the barn. The structure performed exactly as calculated. The insulation held enough heat from the animals' bodies that internal temperature stayed above 45 degrees, even when outside temperature dropped to 5 degrees. He burned 1 small heating stove for his own comfort in the tack room, using 6 pounds of wood per day compared to the 40 pounds per day that Thomas Morrison was burning in his traditional barn. December and January passed quietly. Heinrich worked his land, prepared for spring planting, and noticed that several neighbors had stopped mocking the barn and started asking questions about the curved roof and sloped walls. Jacob Reinhardt visited in early February, ostensibly to borrow a tool, but really to study the interior construction. He ran his hands over the curved ceiling beams, examined the iron-reinforced corners, and left without saying much beyond, "It's warmer than I expected." On March 14, 1884, the sky turned green. Heinrich was in the barn at 2 p.m., mucking stalls, while his animals shifted nervously in their enclosures. The temperature, which had been 61 degrees at noon, dropped to 47 degrees in 20 minutes. The wind, which had been blowing steady from the south at maybe 10 miles per hour, died completely, leaving a silence so profound that Heinrich could hear his heartbeat. He'd never experienced a tornado. Bavaria didn't produce them, but he'd read enough accounts to recognize the warning signs. He secured the animals, double-checking that each stall was latched. He filled water troughs, knowing that if the storm lasted hours, the animals would need hydration. He moved his essential tools, hammer, saw, axe, into the tack room where they'd be accessible if he needed to dig out or make emergency repairs. Then he stepped outside to look west, and what he saw made his stomach drop. The cloud wall stretched from horizon to horizon, black and green and moving like a living thing. Lightning flickered inside it, not branching downward, but illuminating the interior of the cloud like a lantern behind stained glass. The wall was moving east at what looked like 40 or 50 miles per hour, and Heinrich estimated he had maybe 15 minutes before it arrived. He ran to Thomas Morrison's farm, 3/4 of a mile northeast. Thomas was on his roof, hammering down loose shingles that had started flapping in the pre-storm wind, and he either couldn't hear Heinrich shouting or chose to ignore him. Heinrich ran to the Hutchins place, 1/2 mile south, where Reverend Samuel was moving his family into their root cellar. "Heinrich!" Samuel called out. "Get to shelter. This one's going to be bad." Heinrich ran back to his barn, arriving as the first rain started, huge drops that hit like thrown pebbles. He went inside, barred the east and west doors from the interior, and settled into the tack room to wait. The animals were making low, nervous sounds, but the thick walls muffled the growing wind, and the barn felt solid beneath him. The storm hit at 2:47 p.m. The wind arrived first, building from 0 to what must have been 80 miles per hour in under a minute. Heinrich heard it hitting the curved roof and felt the building shudder but hold. The rain came next, horizontal sheets that sounded like gravel being thrown against the walls. Then came hail, stones the size of walnuts that hammered the roof with impacts he felt through his bones. Inside the barn, temperature held at 57 degrees. The animals huddled in their stalls, frightened but protected. The walls creaked as wind pressure built, but the slope design deflected the force upward and over the structure, and the iron stakes held the foundation immovable against the bedrock. Heinrich could hear debris hitting the exterior, branches probably, or pieces of equipment torn from other farms, but the double-layered walls absorbed the impacts without splintering. At 3:15 p.m. the sound changed. It started as a low rumble, like distant thunder that didn't fade but grew louder. Then it became a roar, the sound of a freight train mixed with the sound of a waterfall mixed with the sound of the world ending. Heinrich knew with absolute certainty that the tornado was here. The pressure inside the barn dropped so suddenly that his ears popped and the animals screamed. The west door, despite being barred from the inside, bowed inward as external pressure tried to equalize with the sudden low pressure outside. The curved roof groaned as upward force tried to lift it, but the force distributed evenly across the arched surface, spreading across every beam and bracket instead of concentrating at corners and edges. The foundation stakes held, the mortared limestone held, the iron brackets held, and the barn held. For 4 minutes the tornado passed directly over Heinrich's property. He felt the building shudder like a living thing fighting to stay rooted. He heard the roof beams flex, heard the walls creak, heard what sounded like explosions outside as other structures disintegrated. The noise was so overwhelming that he couldn't think, could barely breathe, could only crouch in the tack room with his hands over his ears, while his life's work was tested against forces he'd only been able to imagine when he'd done the calculations. Then, like a switch being flipped, it stopped. The roar faded to rain. The pressure equalized. The wind dropped to maybe 30 miles per hour. Heinrich waited 5 minutes, then 10, before he trusted that it was over. When he finally opened the east door and stepped outside, the world had changed. Thomas Morrison's barn was gone, not damaged, gone. The foundation stones were still there, scattered across what had been the barn floor, but everything else had vanished. Heinrich could see debris scattered across the prairie for half a mile in every direction. Boards, shingles, tools, pieces of equipment, and in the middle of it all, 3 dead cows that had been in the barn when the tornado hit. The Hutchins house had lost its entire second floor. The roof and upper walls had been peeled away like someone opening a tin can, leaving the first floor exposed to the sky. The family was emerging from their root cellar, alive but staring at the ruins of their home, with expressions of shock so profound they looked like sleepwalkers. Martha Chen's property, a mile and a half east, had been completely destroyed. Her house was a pile of rubble. Her husband's lumber mill was scattered across 3 counties. The only thing standing was the stone foundation of what had been their largest storage shed, and even that had been cracked by debris impact. Jacob Reinhardt's farm had been hit on the western edge. His barn, a tall, proud, American-style structure with a high gambrel roof and a weather vane that had cost $40, had collapsed inward. The roof had lifted off, rotated 90 degrees in the air, and come down on top of the walls, crushing everything inside. Jacob himself had survived in his root cellar, but when Heinrich found him 2 hours later, he was digging through the wreckage looking for his prize breeding bull. They found the bull at sunset, crushed beneath a roof beam. Jacob wept. In total, the tornado killed 11 people in Saline County that day. 9 of them had taken shelter in barns or outbuildings that collapsed. 2 had been caught outside trying to secure animals. The property damage exceeded $200,000, a catastrophic sum that would take the county a decade to recover from. Heinrich's barn had a few scratches on the west wall where flying debris had gouged the wood. One of the roof beams had a hairline crack that would need reinforcement. The doorframe on the east side had warped slightly and would need adjustment, but the structure stood intact, fully functional, with every animal inside alive and unharmed. 3 days after the tornado, Thomas Morrison came to Heinrich's property, riding a borrowed horse because his own animals were dead. He was 61 years old, had survived 34 Kansas tornado seasons, and had just watched the third barn he'd built in his lifetime disappear in 4 minutes. He dismounted slowly, favoring his left leg where a flying board had gashed him during the storm, and stood for a long time just looking at Heinrich's barn. "I need to see the inside," he finally said. Heinrich showed him everything. He explained the curved roof and how it distributed force. He showed the sloped walls and how they deflected wind upward. He demonstrated the foundation stakes, still locked into bedrock, and explained the mathematics of upward force and how mass and anchoring resisted it. He walked Thomas through the double-layered walls, the insulation, the iron brackets, the inward swinging doors. Thomas listened to all of it, running his hands over the construction, testing joints, examining angles. When Heinrich finished, Thomas was quiet for almost a minute. Then he said, "I was wrong about this. I was wrong about you." His voice cracked slightly. "I've been building barns for 30 years, and I've been building them wrong." "You were building what you'd seen work," Heinrich said. "But you'd never seen this tested because everyone who built this way either succeeded and wasn't remarkable or failed before the test came." "Can you help me rebuild?" Thomas asked. "I don't have much money left, but I can work and I can learn." Within a week, 7 families had come to study Heinrich's barn. Reverend Hutchins brought a notebook and sketched diagrams. Martha Chen measured angles with a homemade protractor and copied the foundation design. Jacob Reinhardt spent 3 hours examining the roof beams and asking questions about the steaming and bending process. By May 1884, 4 families had started construction on curved roof barns with sloped walls and reinforced foundations. Thomas Morrison built his 4th barn using Heinrich's design, reducing the peak height from 22 feet to 13 feet, installing iron foundation stakes, and creating a curved roof from steamed cottonwood. The work took him 6 weeks longer than traditional construction and cost $47 more in materials, but when he finished, he had a structure that could survive what he'd already seen, destroy everything 3 times. Dr. Edward Phillips, a civil engineer who worked for the Kansas Pacific Railroad and had been studying tornado damage patterns for 8 years, visited Heinrich's farm in June 1884. He was a precise man who carried measuring instruments and a camera, and he spent 2 full days examining the barn, taking photographs and filling notebooks with calculations. He published his findings in the Kansas City Star on July 12, 1884, under the headline, "German Immigrants' Barn Design Demonstrates Superior Wind Resistance." His article included technical analysis. The curved roof eliminates concentration points for uplift force. Traditional peaked roofs create surfaces perpendicular to upward wind flow, resulting in force multiplication at corners and edges. Mr. Wolf's design distributes uplift across the entire surface area, reducing peak stress by an estimated 58%. Combined with foundation anchoring and sloped walls that deflect lateral wind force, the structure demonstrates resistance to tornadic wind speeds that conventional construction cannot achieve. By 1886, similar barn designs had appeared throughout Saline County and neighboring counties in central Kansas. The design was often called wolf barns or storm barns, and while each builder adapted the basic principles to their specific needs, the core elements remained consistent: curved roofs without corners, sloped walls, reinforced foundations with deep anchoring, and double-layer construction with insulation for added mass. A study conducted by the Kansas State Agricultural College in 1889 examined 73 barns that had survived tornadoes between 1884 and 1889. Of the 41 barns built using traditional vertical wall, peaked roof design, 6 had survived intact. Of the 32 barns built using curved roof, sloped wall design, 29 had survived intact. The statistical difference was stark. Traditional design showed a 14.6% survival rate. Curved design showed a 90.6% survival rate. The economic impact was equally measurable. Families who rebuilt using the curved design reported construction costs averaging 18% higher than traditional barns, approximately 35 in 50 tartines additional investment. But they reported zero rebuilding costs after storms compared to families using traditional designs who faced rebuilding costs averaging $180, $250 every 8 to 12 years. Over a 20-year period, the curved design saved an average of $320 per family, enough to purchase 256 acres of land at homestead prices. The design spread beyond Kansas. By 1892, versions appeared in Nebraska, eastern Colorado, and Dakota Territory. Railroad workers building section houses in tornado-prone regions adapted the curved roof principle. Farmers in Indian Territory used it for tornado shelters. The curved roof design merged with traditional Native American earth lodge construction in some regions, creating hybrid structures that combined both traditions' understanding of how wind interacts with curved surfaces. Heinrich himself lived quietly. He married in 1886. A widow named Anna Bergman, who'd lost her husband in the same 1884 tornado, and who appreciated a man who built for survival rather than appearances. They had 3 children and expanded the farm to 320 acres by 1895. Heinrich built 2 additional barns using the same design, along with a house that incorporated sloped walls and a curved roof, though neighbors thought that was taking things too far. Thomas Morrison became Heinrich's closest friend and strongest advocate. He rebuilt his entire farm using curved roof principles and survived the tornado seasons of 1886, 1891 and 1898 without losing a single structure. When he died in 1903 at age 80, his obituary in the Salina Journal mentioned his success as a wheat farmer and his service as county agricultural advisor. But it didn't mention that he'd helped introduce tornado-resistant construction to central Kansas. Jacob Reinhardt never rebuilt using the curved design. He constructed a traditional tall barn in 1885, and it survived until the tornado of 1893 destroyed it. He rebuilt again in 1894, and it stood until his death in 1908. His sons sold the property in 1910, and the new owner's first act was to tear down the barn and build a curved roof structure in its place. Heinrich died on February 3, 1921, at age 79. His obituary mentioned his service to the community, his successful farm, and his large family. It didn't mention the barn he'd built in 1883, because by 1921, curved roof tornado-resistant barns were so common in central Kansas that no one remembered they'd once been controversial. The original barn stood until 1957, when Heinrich's grandson finally tore it down to make room for modern equipment storage. Before demolition, a photographer from Kansas State University documented the structure. Those photographs, stored in the university's Agricultural History Archive, show foundation stakes still locked in bedrock after 74 years, roof beams with minimal deterioration, and walls that remained plumb and solid despite 3/4 of a century of wind, rain, and temperature cycles. In 2014, a team of structural engineers from the University of Kansas used computer modeling to analyze historical tornado-resistant barn designs. They built digital models of both traditional and curved roof designs and simulated tornado wind forces using modern fluid dynamics software. Their results, published in the Journal of Structural Engineering, confirmed what Heinrich Wulff had calculated by hand in 1883. Curved roofs reduce peak uplift force by 62% compared to traditional peaked roofs, and sloped walls reduce lateral force by 20 to 28% compared to vertical walls. The paper concluded, the design principles employed by 19th-century German immigrant builders demonstrate sophisticated understanding of wind dynamics and structural engineering that preceded formal scientific analysis by several decades. Today, you can still see variations of Heinrich's design throughout Kansas, though most people don't recognize what they're looking at. Some old barns with gentle curved roofs and slightly sloped walls still stand on farms that have been in families for generations. Modern tornado-resistant construction uses different materials: reinforced concrete, steel framing, engineered anchoring systems, but the principles remain identical. Eliminate corners where force concentrates, deflect rather than resist wind flow, and anchor to bedrock rather than resting on surfaces. The question isn't whether Heinrich Wulff's design worked. The survival statistics prove it did. The question is why the knowledge got lost, why it had to be rediscovered through computer modeling 130 years later, and why we keep learning the same lessons at the cost of lives and property. Maybe it's because we build for appearance rather than function, or because we trust tradition more than observation, or because we're so convinced that new equals better that we forget to ask whether old equals proven. If these stories matter to you, if you believe that practical wisdom shouldn't disappear just because it's unfashionable, please subscribe to Pioneer Survival Tales and help preserve this knowledge. Share this story with someone who builds, who farms, who understands that survival isn't about pride, it's about physics. And drop a comment telling me what city and country you're from, because this community is global, and these lessons belong to everyone who's willing to learn them. The frontier taught hard lessons, and Heinrich Wulff was one of the people smart enough to learn them before they killed him.